Our first session today is with Angela Fan. Angela is a research scientist at Meta, has a PhD in machine learning and text generation, and she leads Meta's chatbot efforts, which they presented at the Connect event recently. And she'll be interviewed by our awesome Bloomberg Tech co-host, Ed Ludlow. Over to you guys.
Thank you. This is a conversation I've really been looking forward to because across our research at Bloomberg Intelligence and definitely on the Bloomberg Technology Show, what's happened in 2023 is academia has met research in the lab, has met big tech. And at Meta, that it kind of accounts for your entire job. You oversee LLM development. But what does a research scientist at Meta do? What is your day-to-day like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been very interesting reflecting on what's happened.
Yes.
So when I started my career, I actually worked on language modeling. They weren't large at the time, and I was told, like, okay, this is a very, very academic pursuit, Angela. Like, maybe you should work on like some other stuff. And so like within the company, I started working on other things, like predominantly in machine translation. But I think we've seen like a very, very interesting change in the last year or so, where the power of language modeling has become known by the general public. And so I feel like people like ChatGPT and are excited about Gen AI because a bunch of people have tried a bunch of different things and like generally had a really good experience. And so you see this like change now where it's really focused a lot more on the product. And so for research scientists at Meta, we cover a wide variety of different things, but a lot of our efforts are like on the fundamental research side. So like what are some of the cornerstone problems of large language models today? Factuality, hallucination, lack of recency. And so we do a lot of work on that, which we're very proud to open source. But then we also cover a lot of applied research. So we think about how do we take some of these large language models and how do we develop what I think of as like production-facing model capabilities. Like how are you able to take a large language model, make it conversational, make it interactive, make it entertaining, like all of the different use cases.
Which is the subject of this discussion,
right.
Chatbots for entertainment and utility.
Exactly.
Before we get to the consumer-facing part of generative AI is
right.
a chatbot. We can get to that. Just explain where Meta is in its development of large language models. You have LLAMA, brilliant name, and you have LLAMA 2.
Yep.
What does that represent for the work you've been doing for basically a very long time?
Yeah, so we've had years of research in this area from all sorts of types of generative AI. So in investments in computer vision, for image generation, or some of the new work in video generation, to like a lot of the work in text generation, years of work on machine translation. But a lot of that manifested in our original LLAMA effort, where we've had like a lot of work on data, a lot of work and investment on scaling. Even our investment in PyTorch, enabled us to be able to have this kind of structure, and also some of the infrastructure research that we've done on the research supercluster. So a lot of that culminated together in the original LLAMA, which
we're talking about the compute required to train the models.
Exactly. And so when we developed the original LLAMA, I think we underestimated the excitement because we released it as kind of like researchers only rather than commercial licensing for open source. And then we were hit with like so many requests. And so that really made us think a lot about like how we want to develop LLAMA 2. And of course now we're working on LLAMA 3 and like all the llamas, the whole herd.
The whole herd. And as a part of that, the herd is open source. And I guess in our coverage at Bloomberg News and on the show, open source is in the news cycle, and it is a subject of debate among our guests that come on the show. Meta has been committed to an open source approach. Why is that helpful in your work?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Like one is just like a philosophical perspective on like how you think research should be done. And I think if you think of research as like a predominantly scientific endeavor, what's that American phrase? Like you stand on the shoulder of giants or things like that. And so I think like there's a lot of open research questions that need to be solved. And in order to solve them, most likely the entire community across the world will band together and make a lot of progress. And so if you keep a lot of things internal and are not open and sharing some of those things, like many people will actually work slower. They'll repeat some of the things. They won't share a lot of the learning. So I think that's like one perspective. I think another perspective that I have is like, as a powerful technology. I don't think people have really been successful historically in like keeping powerful technologies hidden and preventing other people from accessing them. And so I think that's another aspect. And finally, I actually think open source technology eventually becomes safer. So if you think about Linux, actually the Linux kernel has very few bugs. I don't know if you've all have ever tried to even file a bug against a Linux kernel, but yeah, they are like, this is not a bug. So I think a lot of things in language model development and in Gen AI also talk about safety and transparency and the responsible development. And so having things out in the world for everybody to scrutinize, I actually think ultimately results in a much safer thing and safer products for people.
One of the facets of the Biden executive order on AI safety, guardrails, regulation, is viewed as somewhat restrictive on the open source movement. Do you agree with that? And then what was your interpretation of it?
Yeah, I think this is complicated because there's so many different facets of different types of open source technology. So I think right now, like we're in an area where there's not a lot of community consensus on how large language models or other types of generative AI should be controlled. And so like should we release for the purposes of scientific research like a completely unregulated, no safety, incorporated into the model at all? I think that's an open question. And so I'm interested to see like how a lot of these things evolve, but also partner with the community, like the Stanford Transparency Index that came out recently, right? I think like the ways that different people are thinking about it, it's quite important to bring together. And I also think dialogue across like academia, like you mentioned, but also like other industry labs has been fun.
I hope to make this a little bit interactive, so if you'll indulge me, a show of hands, anyone in the room, if you use either Facebook, the legacy Facebook platform, or Instagram as an example. And for those who aren't in the room, that's quite a lot of you. So the obvious question is, how does all of the research and work that you've done as a data scientist translate to a chatbot-like tool in Meta's world, the company formerly known as Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of different ways that people engage with the platform. So across our different family of apps, you have like your standard Facebook app, Instagram, WhatsApp, and people have different use cases for them. And so right now we're very interested in exploring a whole variety of different possibilities, from utility use cases like the assistant, maybe like things like, I don't know, travel planning, or like you're asking a factual question. So we have a partnership with Bing to bring in more recent information. But we're also very interested in exploring what I consider more like entertainment use cases. So things that are just like fun, interactive, exciting. I think that's like also one area where people come to our products. I think that another area that people come to use the different products is to explore their interests. So I'm very interested in sheep. I know it's like extremely
Hold on, we
striking.
were on llamas a minute ago, so go with sheep.
Well, okay, so I like animals in general. So like sheep, llama, like they're very cute. But I don't have other friends who share this interest. So I'm always like on all the groups, just like looking at sheep pictures. And yeah, I would love to have like, like a bot that would like to engage in my sheep interest. Also football, I'm a big supporter of the Tennessee Titans, which nobody else seems to be a fan of. So, like so there's a lot of different use cases there. There's also a lot of use cases in developer productivity that we're interested in exploring, right? Like you can think about GitHub Copilot.
Yes.
We just talked about, making Bloomberg analysts a little bit more efficient. So I think that's also a really exciting thing. And then we're also interested in helping creators. I think Mark announced at Connect like a kind of creator agents type effort, as well as like a business agent. So if you think about businesses that need to do customer support, especially like WhatsApp in India or like WeChat in China, like I'm doing everything on WeChat over there. And so there's a lot of possibility for businesses to engage their customers at scale with these types of tools.
The developer tool side of this is really interesting. Mark did announce that at Connect, but this Monday, when OpenAI had its first developers conference, they basically positioned themselves as opening up GPT to build other companies, right? I think that's how they position themselves. What did you make of the progress and development of GPT that they've done so far in what has been an astonishing year in your world?
Yeah, I mean, I was very excited about OpenAI Dev Day. You know, I was like there following all the live tweets and everything. I think I really like the expansion on plugins, for example. So before, I think you had to pre-select some of your plugins, and now, you know, ChatGPT will route to the different plugins. I think that's a very powerful type of technology because ultimately language models, though they're awesome, they do have several fundamental limitations. Big one is recency, right? Like you can't access a lot of real-time information unless you're continuously training, which is quite expensive. And so I think a lot of these different ways to leverage other things like plugin type technology is quite interesting. And then I also think just making the technology more available to other people to experiment with and trial with. Ultimately, it's still quite nascent. And so I think the more people can actually interact and figure out, okay, like what's good, what's bad, what needs improvement, also helps drive our research. Like what should we research next?
It's amazing to see somebody so animated and positive about this work. Actually, let's try and break a little bit of news. Who came up with Llama and Llama 2? I get that it's the spelling is deliberate, but was it you? Was it Mark? Come on.
The machinery, the names. Well, I don't know. The team has like a bunch of proposals. We had a few ideas. You know, in the end, like Llama, you know, large language model.
No, I get that point. But come on. Let's be honest. No, I'll leave it be. You seem to have a very human relationship with generative AI.
Okay.
I hope you know that you get excited about it. And we're talking about chatbots, right? To the everyday average person, we're talking about a chatbot essentially. So what makes a good chatbot? Either have a good utility or make it entertaining on the other side of the scale.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, stepping back from chatbots for 1 second, I think generative AI right now, like one thing that's happening is like there's a lot of possible products that can be built, but I don't think like any product has really like nailed it yet. And in that sense, like I think, okay, is it a toothbrush behavior, like something we would naturally go to every day? And that I kind of think lends itself to many utility use cases. So for example, like if you're in your Google Doc, you know, and you want your wording to be smoothed over, you like can click a button. That's like very natural and integrated into something you're using. Like I just got back from vacation. My husband is like horrible taking pictures of me. There's always like someone in the background. So I'm over there in Photoshopping, like I gotta infill this person so I have like a nice picture I can send to my mom, you know? So I think like those are very natural use cases. When it comes to chatbots, I think part of the power before that's changed is like you can actually communicate in natural language, which is like a very natural interface for people broadly to be able to get what they want.
Which alongside text generation is kind of your background where you've done a big body of your research.
Yeah, and I think that's like a big change that's made Gen AI so powerful now, where you can just kind of like tell the bot in like human words what you want it to produce. And so I think that's where chatbots are quite exciting. And to get back to like your original question on what makes a chatbot good, I think a lot of it has to do with the value you deliver to users and what users want and what they're looking for, and also the surface. So I think when you think about taking research into production, you know, people are not there like on their dev machine, you know, talking to the bot. They're in like some sort of actual app surface. And so as well, like kind of figuring out, okay, how does it look in the UI? How do you make it accessible? How do you integrate other tooling? So for example, we have like our Bing search plugin, but we also have image generation with Imagine. So how do you make those things understandable to users that these are features that are available?
The first, and what I'm reflecting on is what happened over the last 12 months. But in the first instance, what really seized the public consciousness was ChatGPT, right?
Yeah,
and that is principally a text generation tool. And with DALL-E and other tools, you know, image generation and quickly became the point of conversation. Now we have people coming on to the show, Bloomberg Technology, talking to our analysts about down the line a world where you can very quickly create full-scale video games, full-scale movies using generative AI. How much of your work focuses on those kind of what seem distant use cases because we can't sort of see it right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So last year I was working on this team where the goal was to create, it was text to video. So the idea was like, okay, we were gonna input any like natural language query and be able to generate a short form video. Yeah, it turns out it's like much harder than you think. So I would say we, you know, even last year we were generating what I would call more generously like animated images. So closer to like a GIF, a little bit of animation, but still pretty blurry. But if you're looking at like the progress in image generation, like things are becoming so crisp, so high definition, and a lot of the tells earlier. So like a few years back, like how could you tell an image was generated? You would look at the hairline, it would be like really fuzzy or like curls. Anything with curly hair, the curl wouldn't be continuous, or the fingers. Nowadays,
What was the technical limitation behind that? Why?
yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with the data as well, like having large scale data, really high quality data, data that's paired text to image, but also just like the power of the model itself. And so some of the more recent diffusion type approaches, for example, for generation, rather than using like GANs, when I first started my research career, like GANs were the hottest thing, but it was very hard to scale those to like high resolution type images.
Well, can I ask, I know, and I hope you won't mind me saying, I know you just spend a lot of your time coding, just like sitting there coding, but how conscious as a researcher focused on software are you of the developments in even the last year on the silicon side, the hardware and compute side, and has that unlocked anything for you in your work?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because I feel like when people talk about AI, there's like, oh, this idea of like, okay, so much software, but then also it's so dependent on compute.
By the way, spoiler, there are some chip and cloud people in the room, so keep going. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I think one thing that's been really exciting is like, in order to make a lot of progress in AI today, I think there's almost like a change where people are trying to vertically integrate more across the stack from hardware to software. And so I think one of the biggest questions has been like, what kind of compute cluster do you have? And like, how does that influence your model design as well? Which is not something that like most people thought about many years ago. It would just be like, oh, I went on AWS or Azure, like I logged into my cloud machine or something. And so I think it's quite interesting to follow what's possible when we talk about scaling our models or flops. A lot of it is like, okay, how efficiently can I use the GPU? How can I like condense some of the CUDA kernels and merge them so it runs even faster? And so I'm quite interested in a lot of that. And on Meta side, we have investments in things like the research supercluster that actually powered Llama and like made it possible to train large scale. And at the time, like a lot of those investments, it wasn't clear if they were going to pay off. Like, why do you need a cluster so large? But it turns out, yeah, it's useful.
And is that simply a function that with time, the models that are being built just have many more billions of parameters and it's a data crunching issue? Or is it that there are now lots of different, very specific models? They may have fewer parameters, but it goes back to this idea of like a chatbot being sort of a general tool. You're talking about its utility being tied to a specific use case. Everyone everywhere seems to be building a model with now a more narrow focus. That's a really uninformed academic observation, but I'm trying to understand what's happening out there in your field.
Yeah, I think there's the idea that if you do large-scale pre-training, where the model just kind of like ingests all different types of data from all over, then you'll have a very general knowledge base, and then you can then use that to have fine-tuned models that are specialized in specific domains that are really good at that area and can serve a narrow use case. I think when you talk about developing products, like many companies only care about specific verticals or specific applications. And so it makes a lot of sense to start from that general purpose knowledge where the model starts really well, and then you fine tune for your specific use case. I think one of the biggest changes in NLP overall has been it's better to start from this general model and go specific than to just train a more specific model from the start.
And going back to your cluster point, that it seemed a year ago that those able to do that were the ones that had access to the compute, and it's become kind of slightly more democratized. One of your other pieces of research was on device, and I sit next to Kunjan Sabani, who is one of our chips analysts at Bloomberg Intelligence, and he and I talk about this all the time. So Qualcomm, for example, demoed a few months ago the ability to run a large language model with a few billion parameters on a cell phone that's in airplane mode. And I have to be honest, I kind of sat there at the time and I was like, so what? I don't really get it. But that is something that would excite you about AI in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I think, and you can tell with the open source bit of our discussion, I'm interested in like getting technology in the hands of many people and making it more accessible. I think part of that is also why I did a lot of research in machine translation and extending models to many different languages. Actually, English is my third language, and so I think it's just like important to make things accessible. And one thing that's not accessible about large language models is frankly how big they are, right? Like in order to use them, you need quite a bit of access to compute. And one of the things I was thinking about as well is like for a lot of academic researchers who are working in the public sector, they may not have access to a lot of the large scale compute that we have, which is actually like an important question for us as like a scientific field. Like this is a problem that we should probably confront. And so when it comes to on-device, I think there's many reasons, you don't have Wi-Fi, or you want to keep your data private as well. So there's many motivations to have on-device work. And I think the major questions right now are like, can we keep the quality high so that people can have the level of performance that they expect on these various different applications, while also having enough compression to run things on your actual phone. And then practically, is your phone about to turn into a brick because it's like so hot and using up your battery so quickly? So I think there's a lot of open questions, but I've been really excited by the progress that we've made.
I'm glad you mentioned the word progress. How would you summarize 2023 as a year in AI? For lots of people in this room, 2023 was the year of AI. But you've been working in AI for quite a long time. I wondered if you shared that kind of short-term, real-time perspective.
Well, I would definitely say this is the year that my mother finally realized that I do something of like slight value. So that's been great. For many years, she was always pointing at my husband. She was like, don't you think he's doing like much better? And I was like, oh, thanks, Mom. Like feeling the love, So that's one thing. I think this is the year of like mainstream AI, where I think like many people have realized like there's exciting products, and I'm excited to see like a lot of people, have like interacted with these things and have a lot of questions and have noticed also many of the limitations that we're excited to do research on. And so I think that's been the theme of the year. And it's also been exciting because this is the first year I've worked extensively on the product side of things. And so I feel like I personally gained like a very...
We're talking about Meta's family of platforms and products that you're now working more closely with.
Yeah, exactly.
So what does that look like?
The chatbots, essentially. Like the assistant, the characters, many of the products that we announced at Connect. And so personally, I feel like a little bit of evolution in some of my research thinking, where I feel closer than ever to like some of the ways that users experience problems as they use our products, but also in like understanding, just having the model alone, it's completely different from the product experience, right? Like I think model is one thing, then API is another thing, where like the API may not necessarily just be the model. Like there's many things wrapped up into that, but then the product is like a totally different other thing, where so many things of the UI and the UX components and all of that drive the user experience. And so I feel like I've stepped back a lot personally and just like thought much more holistically about how some of the research that we're doing like manifests, it could be many, many years later, like in the hands of somebody.
If I'm a product manager, and I've learned over the years, having covered Meta, that they have very specific roles, but doing something at Meta, do you find it easy or difficult to explain to them what you're trying to do in order to match what they're asking for in return?
I think some of the weird ways it manifests are like, they'll be like, oh, can we do this thing? And I'm like, okay, if it's an open research problem, like I'll get back to you in like 2 to 3 years. Or like, oh no, we support that already.
That is an unacceptable timeline based on Zuckerberg's year of efficiency, I think. So, but carry on.
Yeah, no, I think that's like the most interesting dichotomy, like explaining like what is possible today versus like what is a fundamental research problem. And I think sometimes the LLMs seem like quite magical. And so you're like, oh, well, like, why doesn't it work? And I think one of the other ways to think about it that I have come to this year is like, for a product, people want things to work 100% of the time. Like, if I pick up my phone, like, I want it to be able to work. And so the fact that many things are working in research like 80% of the time, it's not really reaching like a bar that we would want to put out in the hands of millions of people. And so I think explaining that like that last 20% gap may be like a multi-year effort of research to bridge. And so like even though the functionality exists, it's not really like solid enough to launch. I think that's been like something that we've really like spent a lot of time talking through.
You mentioned that you speak 3 languages, aside from your research in text generation and natural language. That was an interesting story to follow this year. OpenAI communicated quite proactively when it was able to open up access to either ChatGPT or GPT 3.54 in Japan, for example. How difficult is that challenge of training a large language model on different languages?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many possible ways to train, but some of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about are like, is it going to be a high quality user experience? And I think part of that is because we've done a lot of work in English, scrutinizing, for example, many aspects of safety and how people may or may not be harmed by this type of technology, but like that work has really lagged behind in other languages. So if you name like a random language that many hundreds of millions of people may speak, I want to make sure that we can guarantee that people are like having a generally positive experience. And so it's not just about having the capability in the foundational model, but also having like, the whole infrastructure of integrity that we have on Facebook Blue app today, of also making sure that if users submit reports, we're able to review those reports, we're able to look at some of the safety concerns, we're able to make sure they have a high quality experience, that search works. And so I think that's where there's a big difference between like having some multilingual support in our models and like being able to bring it to market.
There is a existential concern about the development that's taken place in large language models and more broadly the impact of AI on mankind. Do you have that feeling of an existential worry? You're deeper in the research than almost anyone on the planet.
It's a good question. For me, I think no. I think part of it is because you know how the sausage is made, So like if you dive deep, you're like, oh, well, like it's not magical, right? I do think there's a lot of exciting capabilities that have surprised us. So for example, many people thought that creativity would be like one of the things that AI really struggles with. The AI would be like really good at like math problems or like adding things, crunching numbers, and then like creative expression would be something that humans kind of retain. But Gen AI, I think, like puts that in reverse.
Well, it has become entertaining, which makes me think about most recently Grok. In that case, have you had an opportunity to experiment with Grok on early access?
I have not gotten a chance to experiment with Grok or with the new Yi model yet, but I'm looking forward.
So let's end here. You kind of reflected on 2023. We've gone across research, data science, real-world application through Meta, and also the hardware component, which was kind of fun. And we'll be speaking more about that later in this conference. But what do you see happening in 2024? And even if it's through the lens of like, what is a challenge for you next year, something that you want to dig into or crack on the research side?
Yeah, I think there's many different research problems that I'm interested in. So I think one of the big ones is like, how do you improve hallucination or factuality, which I think is like a big concern for many different product use cases as well. I'm interested in making continued progress on safety, being really fine-grained to understand different safety situations as well, and kind of continuing on some of that responsible AI direction. I think I'm interested as well in a lot of reasoning capabilities. So having models be able to form longer chains of reasoning. On the image side, I think that manifests a lot, like you said, in like movie generation, just being able to generate longer, more continuous things to tell a story or to really achieve an objective. And then on the product side, I think I'm mostly just interested in like seeing how users interact with some of the products that we've put out, thinking about new exciting features, and then ultimately like launching new stuff as new technology comes through. So I'm also very excited about, in particular, some of the work we've done on Imagine, the image generation plugin. It's kind of like Midjourney, but it's free. So I feel like that's quite interesting to see like what people are using for that, and like trying to see how it can help people share more expressive content across family of apps.
Angela Fan of Meta, we packed quite a lot in. I don't think I've ever had a panel where we've covered such a broad range of subject matter. Thank you so much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Angela Fan, thank you.